People jumped out and started building like a kitchen in the middle. This was their kind of kitchen to serve the masses who they were hoping were going to come out. And then gradually, kind of really quite quickly, actually, this square filled up with protesters, all in kind of fabulous, exotic, kind of eye-catching day glow outfits and stuff. And it was you just got a sense of a really kind of, obviously, the fact that they were, in a sense, striking at the heart of London was really dramatic, but also the level of organisation, I have to say, was impressive.
Climate protesters are using increasingly dramatic tactics to sound the alarm over global warming.
Mounting roadblocks, scaling huge oil rigs, and even throwing soup on famous works of art.
But has it actually made a difference?
That's our climate question from the BBC World Service. I'm Jordan Dunbar.
And I'm Greer Jackson. With us is the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rowlatt, and you've just made a new podcast series called 10 Fights That Made the Green Movement, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Yes, getting out there. Yeah, no, hello, great to be here. Yeah, we've made a series exploring the kind of evolution of green ideas through the conflicts that have shaped the green movement, going all the way back to the kind of origin story of Greenpeace, all sorts of different organisations taking different routes, and the often very vigorous discussions that are engendered by the actions that they undertake.
Can you remember a very dramatic protest that you've seen or you've been involved in?
I think one of the most dramatic was when Extinction Rebellion, which is a kind of UK protest organisation that tried to get mass groups of people out on the streets, and they occupied Trafalgar Square, and suddenly these trucks pulled up and the backs swung open and people jumped out and started building like a kitchen in the middle. This was their kind of kitchen to serve the masses who they were hoping were going to come out. And then gradually, kind of really quite quickly, actually, this square filled up with protesters, all in kind of fabulous, exotic, kind of eye-catching day glow outfits and stuff. And it was you just got a sense of a really kind of, obviously, the fact that they were, in a sense, striking at the heart of London was really dramatic, but also the level of organisation, I have to say, was impressive. And then the idea, it's a big roundabout, so the idea was to kind of stop traffic, cause disruption, draw attention, they would say, to the climate issue.
So it felt like a real climate takeover then in the centre of London?
Yeah, it really did. It really it's exactly what it felt like. And there was this kind of festival atmosphere. So it was kind of music and singing and chanting, and there was a very kind of upbeat feel about it. Obviously, and then the police came and the kind of tone changed a little, and they were sort of gluing themselves to the street. And it was quite a dramatic event to cover as a reporter.
And hard to ignore.
Well, hard to ignore. Certainly for Londoners, for everyone in the UK, it became a really big story. And that was the intention of Extinction Rebellion. They said, we're not doing enough to tackle this existential crisis, but obviously not just Britain, but the world. We need to draw attention to it. And they felt they had a new tool that would allow people to do that. The argument was, if other people saw how many people really cared about something being done about this issue, it would kind of normalise the idea of climate action. And the big debate, of course, is whether or not that evaluation was accurate or not.
We'll get into that more, I'm sure. But you've been following the Green Movement for 20 years now, I think it is. And in that time,
in various different guises for the BBC. 20 years this year, in fact.
20 years this year. What an anniversary. I mean, so what's your assessment of what the Green Movement has achieved?
It's so difficult to say, isn't it? Because the Green Movement is so many different things. So everything from those really dramatic kind of public demonstrations all the way to kind of behind the scenes kind of lobbying that maybe we never actually even find out about, just a kind of word in a politician's ear here and there, which mainstream, campaigning organisations will tend to operate across that whole spectrum. So you look at something like Greenpeace, and Greenpeace, for example, in China has this kind of semi-official status as a kind of advisory body in a way to the Chinese government. So sits on bodies and discusses the best way to tackle, environmental issues in China. One of the things I really early on, so I used to work for a programme called Newsnight here on the BBC in Britain. And at the time, there was a big campaign by a campaigning organisation here, been around for years, called Friends of the Earth, saying that we should have a law enforcing making governments legally obliged to tackle climate change. Big issue, and they had this. It wasn't a direct action campaign. It was a kind of write-in, sort of encouraging people to support the campaign. And as part of that, they had a band called Radiohead, who really popular global rock band, and two of the leading members of Radiohead put a concert on at a nightclub in central London, in Camden Town. I turned up there to discover that David Cameron, who would later become the Prime Minister of Britain, was there. A guy called David Miliband, who was like the hotshot young kind of pretender for another British political party, the Labour Party, and a whole host of other kind of really senior people had been invited. And, that's a really interesting way of campaigning, isn't it? They'd drawn the politicians in. Obviously, they were Radiohead fans, and they'd come along to sort of see their favourite band. But clearly, that's isn't that a subtle, nuanced form of campaigning with people who have continued to be really influential politicians here in Britain?
So
and we should say the Climate Change Act was enacted. I mean, arguably, that was a really effective campaign, because we got the Climate Change Act originally with an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, and then they continued to lobby. It was originally going to be 60%, is my memory, and then the lobbying by the 200,000 people who signed in, but by Friends of the Earth and others, got it to 80%, and then later on the Conservative government increased that to net zero, and it's still, I think, one of the toughest bits of climate legislation in the world. So a really successful bit of green campaigning.
So you've got their nightclub promotion, pop stars, celebrities taking over city centres. You've got advising governments. You've got legal levers. Very, very different tactics heading towards similar goals. What is it that different organisations have kind of fought over when it comes to these protests and movements?
Got to be honest. I mean, they fought over everything. They fight over, passionate campaigners will dispute courses of action. And this is what our series, 10 Fights, was about, really. The nature of the disputes that that informed climate action and climate campaigning around the world. And it began with the fabulous story about a group of hippies in Vancouver in Canada who become upset at nuclear testing that the Americans are doing in a remote island group way off the coast of Alaska near Russia. And they're like, what on earth are we going to do about this? This is a brilliant moment where a journalist phones them up and one of the activists up and he says, well, what are you going to do about it, guys? You say you've set this committee up to take action. And his wife says, hey, why don't you take a boat and just go to the island? And they get this grizzled sea captain who's got this beaten up old boat, and all these hippies pile on with huge bags of marijuana, of cannabis, and set sail, smoking dope on the way. They get lost. They kind of decide to have they stop at an island and go and then breach the immigration laws of the US. And the Americans who've been following them, waiting for something like this to happen, say, you either go back or we're going to impound your boat. So then there's this huge debate about whether they should have a more confrontational approach and go to the island where the tests are to try and be in the way of the test. They think they've failed. They have these terrible arguments, which mean in the end people literally won't speak to each other anymore. Think they've failed, sail back into Vancouver Harbour to discover that the reports that one of the guys on board has been doing to Canadian broadcasting have actually attracted huge attention. There's loads of people waiting for them. And they're like, hold on a second, we thought we'd failed, but you guys seem to think we're some kind of heroes. And they realise later, they're rationalising afterwards, and they describe it, very hippie term, they describe it as a mind bomb that they'd released into the world consciousness because they'd drawn so much attention to this issue. The Americans obviously are shrewd enough not to immediately stopped the tests, but about 3 or 4 months later, they stopped the tests on these remote islands. So I guess that's a kind of win for the team. I mean, the Americans wouldn't admit that it was related, but it certainly seemed as if it made a difference. And that kind of chaotic trip was the beginning of Greenpeace, which is probably the most iconic environmental campaigning organisation in the world. And they then went on to campaign against whaling really successfully by doing exactly that, getting between whaling boats and whales, and basically it was about filming these incredible interactions that then would go, I mean, wasn't called viral then, but we would call it viral now. And as I say, they described it as a mind bomb. And looking back, interesting, isn't it? Look at Extinction Rebellion essentially is another avenue, another route to get a mind bomb, a kind of explosive event that draws huge public attention to your issue.
But there was a bit of a fight, wasn't there, between XR and Greenpeace about how they should approach. They had the same goal, but they wanted to achieve it in a very different way.
And they wanted to piggyback off the back of Greenpeace, because Greenpeace, the origins way back in the 70s, spooled to the 2020s, and XR is saying we've got this brilliant strategy. We mobilise people, get them on the streets, attract loads of attention, and they were upset because they thought that Greenpeace wasn't really taking enough of the kind of action that they thought was needed. They felt you've got hundreds of thousands of members who you could mobilise to come on the streets and show their passion and demand for climate action to the government and to other British people, and yet you're not kind of really communicating in that way. So they turn up at the Greenpeace offices wearing their kind of high-vis, tabards, holding flowers, and they brought cakes, So they were kind of saying, look, we're friendly, but they said, we're going to occupy your offices and we want to talk to you about your strategy. And the debate went back and forth, varying degrees of intensity for a couple of hours, about 3 hours. And finally, Greenpeace kind of said, I think they said, we'll think about it. But they were thinking, we're not going to sign up to this. And you've got to remember, at this time, Extinction Rebellion hadn't really kind of burst onto the public scene. So Extinction Rebellion go off and then burst onto the public scene and become this huge thing. And the Greenpeace response to that was, well, they're parallel. We're all looking for the same objectives. We're exploring different ways of doing it. I'm not saying what they're doing is wrong, but what we do is what we do, and we're going to continue doing what we do. So it was a really interesting moment of kind of really quite a big division of opinion about how they should proceed. And
so that's XR, one environmental group, holding a protest.
Green on green.
Green on green.
Blue on blue in conflict. But green on green kind of action, trying to mobilise them to do the stuff they wanted, unsuccessfully in this case.
And that happened again, didn't it, within XR? Some in XR wanted to take it much further.
Roger Hallam, the guy who actually led that protest against Greenpeace, he said we need to be more kind of aggressive. We need to go after roads in a more, block roads in a more kind of aggressive way. And he set two organisations up, one called Insulate Britain, another called Just Stop Oil, that were kind of more radical versions of that direct action idea that he'd originally had.
Give us some examples of the things they did.
They did stuff like, there's a big orbital motorway around London, the M25, and they blocked the M25 for 3 days, climbing onto bridges across the motorway, which meant that the motorway wasn't safe for use and closed it down. There were all sorts of reports of people who had hospital appointments and stuff being delayed. Lorry drivers with
ambulances. I remember as well.
Ambulances being delayed.
Yeah.
Also, caused huge kind of anger among a lot of people, and there was then another huge debate about whether that kind of more aggressive direct action was positive or negative. And it became at a time when there was increasing scepticism among British political parties about the effort to tackle climate change and reach what's known as net zero. And so it kind of boosted that side of the argument.
It felt like in the late 2010s, certainly, that climate change was really having a moment. I'm thinking about Greta Thunberg and the school strikes that started in Sweden, but then spread around the world. And it really felt like there was momentum behind climate change movements.
It certainly was. And like I said, when I turned up at that Radiohead gig, there was the right-wing party, the Conservatives, and Britain's more left-wing party, the Labour Party, both represented. Obama, when he was president of the United States, saw environmental action as important. And so, it was a really, really interesting time. And she came, Greta was amazing, the way she came to kind of symbolise the global inaction on the issue in this really, when she went to the UN in New York and said, you've stolen my childhood. It was a really amazing moment.
I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
No politician in the world, I think, could ignore the kind of demands she was making. I mean, some politicians decided, President Trump, for example, decided to push back against it. But I mean, it was a really powerful demand for action.
Was there a moment when you were interviewing the different people in the Green Movement? Because what you've described sounds like, the policy levers of big NGOs like Greenpeace, things are going well. Greta Thunberg, climate activist, speaking to the United Nations. What was it that made Extinction Rebellion, other groups around the world go, no, not enough. It's time for more direct, it's bigger mind bombs. Did anyone say the moment when they felt climate action had just slowed down and they had to take this?
I think there was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a report that said that the effects of climate change above 1.5 degrees would be much more severe, and I think that really worried people. And I think and the trajectory looked like, as indeed it looks like will certainly happen, that we'd pass 1.5. And I think at that point, lots of activists said, well, we must do more, and what can we do, and reassess the tactics to say, should we do more?
How much do you think those tactics worked? I mean, you mentioned that lots of the sort of more disruptive actions around the M25 were perceived as quite negatively, as too much. And certainly I've spoken to people who actually totally turn them off from the climate movement. That's not me. I can't even recognise or attach myself to that. How is it perceived generally? And do you think it made a difference to, say, policy or action on climate?
It really depends what you're talking about. We've already been through some examples where action definitely has made a difference. It was really interesting at the beginning of XR. I think politicians were really wrong-footed by it, and it was a Conservative government at the time, and I remember them inviting in members of XR to talk to really senior politicians in the Houses of Parliament about their concerns. So it really felt at that point there was a real recognition that they were articulating a view that was widely held within in the population, which opinion polls would suggest is right. And then, as you say, there was a moment when it was a rush hour and somebody got on top of a tube train. It's actually a light railway train, a Docklands railway train, and stopped the train. And there was this outpouring of anger. How you're stopping us getting into work. You're saying that your opinion about climate change overrides my right to travel freely around my city. And I think there was a real moment then when they began to lose sympathy. And I think at that point the politicians backed away and said, "Oh, actually, even if they have got a good point, this is all getting a bit toxic, and we don't want to be seen supporting it." But it really depends what you're talking about, because obviously there are different kinds. We talked about the Climate Change Act. That was a really effective bit of environmental action.
Well, it's interesting because if we look at the political landscape today, it's very different to what it was when we're talking about the sort of the high bit of Extinction Rebellion in the late 2010s, where there was political agreement across the spectrum, and at least in the UK. Today, it's very different. It's a very divided picture. How much do you think we can attribute to the sort of the change in the Green Movement when people started to feel a bit alienated by what was happening on tube trains and that sort of
Maybe
thing?
that had a role. I mean, the nature of politics in the UK has changed. Climate change arguments have been tied in with a cost of living debate here in the UK and indeed elsewhere in the world. Too expensive, shouldn't be doing it. America's not doing it, why should we? China's still burning loads of coal, all those kind of arguments. So I think, there are all sorts of different reasons why the debate on climate change has changed in the way it has.
Globally, being a climate protester is now more dangerous because countries around the world have been cracking down on these types of disruptive protests, including in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, walking two or more people walking slowly on the street can be an arrestable offence, which could have a prison sentence associated with it, which is quite extreme. I mean, walking slowly, I frequently walk slowly on the street. And
especially if I'm looking at my phone.
Yes, exactly. Don't expect to be arrested for it. So, there are some quite tough new laws that were brought in Britain, and people say, well, look, you're responsible for that, and people who want to campaign on completely different issues are now affected by that. So there's definitely a big debate about that.
It feels like the Green Movement's kind of stalled in recent years. Do you agree with that assessment? Why do you think that might be, if so?
Well, I mean, that kind of big public protest, that kind of cycle, if you like, of public protests appears to have kind of, passed. I mean, it's really interesting. There's a kind of new, in public informational campaign, the emergency briefing. So a group of really senior emergency health doctor from a hospital, a very senior ex-army officer, there's kind of climate scientists who do what they call an emergency briefing. Like, I don't know if, around the world, the governments during COVID kind of issued these proclamations about how to deal with COVID and what we should all do, and stay at home, don't stay at home, do this, don't do that. And they're trying to echo that kind of COVID emergency kind of presentation to present what they would claim was the real risks of climate change and the long-term impact on us and our environment. And that's a form of campaigning that draws in big public audiences. I mean, it's a less,
provocative,
less combative, less, but nevertheless, is a form of public campaigning. And they've had tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. They've got a video, and they hold events in town halls locally, and they get huge amounts of people. So there's an evolution of campaigning and campaigning techniques that kind of melds both to the kind of legal environment, but also to the times, and I think they feel that the best way to tackle the kind of growing skepticism with politicians is to say to people, well, look, here are the facts about climate change. Effectively, they're saying you make your own mind up, and if you think that your local politicians aren't campaigning on doing the right things for the climate, write to them and take action. So.
Because there's also been, I've noticed, like a rise in legal cases and legal action, which again is a slightly different form of campaigning as well.
Yeah, and that, that often is people with a campaigning background saying, look, there are laws here that we could use to influence decisions. And these are big, actions taken sometimes at a global level, sometimes taken against individual oil companies that if precedents are set, they could go into law in individual countries and have a real effect. So, yeah, there are all sorts of different ways that people are using to try and campaign and make a difference.
One thing I've noticed when we speak with different campaigners around the world is that the word climate is not being used as much. So the objectives are similar, whether it's making solar power more equitable in Pakistan or stopping deforestation in Kenya. Those are all climate objectives, but they're done through energy security or lowering energy prices or clean air.
National security. That's I love it. Yeah.
The climate movement in this way is just being called something else. They're like highlighting other priorities.
America's by far the biggest climate action America has ever done was something called the Inflation Reduction Act. And they would often, they'd link that with national security as a way of saying, we here in the UK, there's a new Prime Minister here in the UK, his first act was to cut VAT on electricity bills, which is something climate campaigners have been saying should happen because we want electricity to be cheaper than gas and people to use electric cars and heat pumps to heat their homes, etc. So to switch to electricity, there hasn't been a single mention of climate change from the new Prime Minister or anyone. Certainly, it happened this morning, but that I've seen yet. And it's all been about cost of living, reducing prices for ordinary working people.
So do you think then we might not hear the words climate change or think about a climate movement, but actually things are still happening. They've just been rebranded and they're looking at other priorities, but it's still a climate objective.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there will be an effort by people to repack it, find other benefits of the kind of action that we're doing and maybe emphasise those a little bit more than the climate actions. But look, this is part of a long cycle of ebbing and flowing of the priority of environmental issues around the world. And, in time, probably it will change. And when you look at the kind of extreme weather and the impacts it's having around the world, lots of people will be thinking, hold on a second, farmers are struggling, we don't have the water. People are dying in the heat. We don't have the water that we need. Somebody should do something about it. And then maybe another kind of cycle of climate action will begin.
It's really interesting to sort of think about how the tactics around the green movement have changed so much in a few decades. You started with these quite strategic but small targeted action that created these mind bombs in the media and public attention, all the way through to sort of collective action to very disruptive action. And now we're seeing a new sort of quieter lobbying to politicians and legal cases. What do you think the next transition might be?
Well, as I say, I think as the impacts of our changing climate become more apparent to people, I think we'll probably get back to more vigorous demands from voters for something to be done to make sure that, they can get the food and water they need to survive, that the roads aren't melting during the summer, that nuclear power stations don't have to close down because they can't cool themselves. All the kind of issues that we've seen in the last couple of months. People will say, well, we need, the basic infrastructure has to work. And one of the key issues here is obviously heat. And if it's only going to get worse, we need to do something about it. So, I think, as I say, I think there'll be probably in time we'll see another change, and maybe more direct calls for action.
Justin, thanks very much for coming in.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
Cheers.
And thank you for watching. Do give us a like if you've enjoyed this so we know to make more. And if you have a climate question of your own that you want us to answer, do comment it below.
And don't forget, you can subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you don't miss a thing. I'm Jordan Dunbar.
And I'm Greer Jackson. See you.
Bye-bye.